Okay, right. Yeah. Shit. Hey, okay. Well, we looked at chapters 7 and 8 in order, and we're up to chapter 9, which is the final chapter. I would remark, of course, that table, what is it, 1 or 2 is actually table 8.1 is actually a good table, and you should consider it when you're looking at the difference between Fordism and post-Fordism or neoliberalism. It's a good way to describe the difference in modes of regulation, and they are contrasting modes. They obviously, it's not perfect, but you can see that there's components of the regulatory state that still exist. Um, some are better than others. Others are ones against which people will react or resist or move their own agendas. Often it's the case that the regulation was actually very necessary, as we've sort of discovered. When you take the regulation away, terrible things can happen. Deprivation can occur, exploitation can occur. Uh, so there are costs or negative elements that come as a result. So anyway, I would point out that table 8.1 is useful in sort of describing the differences. The cutthroat, alienating competition, self-responsibility, and the no envy principle can be contrasted to a stable society that has cradle to grave government social welfare policies. And both exist in the United States, however, badly um, or poorly executed, let's put it that way. Anyway, chapter 9, spatial struggles for emancipation. Um, this is important relative to the whole book because this uh, combines, or this sort of synthesizes what Mizuoka was looking at. So it has 8 sections: spatial praxis to produce counter space, the dominant space of power versus the counter space of the people. And I think you can sort of see that that just does happen. It happens, in good or bad ways, problematic ways, advantageous ways, etc. Section 9.3 is struggles around absolute space. Number one, contiguity and bounding. Remember, we looked at contiguity and bounding in earlier chapters on the difference between that things are contiguous and that bounding is differentiated from territory, for example. The struggles around absolute space. Number two, the dialectics between Wirkungsraum and action space. Number five, section five, is struggles around relative space, counter agglomeration, counter networks, and stray spaces. And we've seen a little bit hinting at some of those elements. Section 6, 9.6, struggles around relational space, absolute space, relative space, relational space, poor people's optimum, and Christoller's central place system. We've seen that described before. 9.7, struggles around spatial scale, porosity, seeing that, and scale jumping. So, porosity is one way in which you could describe, sort of the difference between bounding and borders and territory, et cetera, et cetera. The porosity of the thing that separates folks in space. Section 8, the emancipation from authoritative space, a case of struggles against the human rights infringements by the child guidance centers in Japan. Now, you can see some of that sort of working at a much more fascist way in the United States in terms of what the federal government and the Trump administration is trying to do to Minnesota and its Somali community, and the kind of manipulations that are going on. So, for example, today, the federal government put in new rules. It's regulatory activity, right? New rules in order to demand sort of some weird compliance before they're going to release any money to the state of Minnesota. So it's just partisan politics, if to be polite, but it's just, usual. It's unnecessary. It's fascist. It's actually costly in the sense of using your taxpayer dollars for exercise of power that has no result. I mean, essentially, it's just meant to screw with people without any particular goal. In fact, it's as we've noted before, it's the cruelty as opposed to actually any kind of communal result. So anyway, so that's an aside. Let us now look at the abstract. Subsuming space with the power discussed so far is never complete. In lieu of the conclusion, this chapter presents various spatial strategies in the social struggles regarding the different stages of space subsumption addressed in the order of the preceding chapters. The oppressed and subservient people fight back by exploiting such space that remains unsubsumed as stray space, using such process of space subsumption for their emancipation and empowerment as monopoly rent, and deploying such less oppressive forms of space subsumption as action space. Section 8 presents a struggle against human rights infringements committed by Japan's state power as manifested in the Child Guidance Center, against which the author has engaged for several years. So obviously he has a stake in this in experience. 9.1, spatial praxis to produce counter space. It's not space on a counter, but rather it is oppositional space, let's put it that way. Sovereignty implies space. And what is more, it implies a space against which violence, whether latent or overt, is directed. A space established and constituted by violence, as Lefebvre. Space has, first, been produced and dominated by the state and economic power. The transformation of society presupposes confrontation. People are addicted to crisis or confrontation or anyway. And this confrontation includes struggle for the control of space. Now, we're not talking about outer space. We're just simply talking about, largely terrestrial space, yes? So, quote, physical and social re-engineering and territorial organization of these sites is a weapon in political struggles, as David Harvey Space, therefore, constitutes an indispensable moment, an instrument for leverage in the struggle of the people against the power. As it is already clear, the subsumption of space is in itself the process of creating the spatial configurations for the dominating power. Social space is created to be politically instrumental in that it facilitates the control of society and underpins the reproduction of existing production relations and property relations, as well as the dominating set of institutional and ideological superstructures. Lefebvre. Steve Pyle states, in this regard, authority produces space through, for example, cutting up space, differentiating between parcels of space, the use and abuse of borders and markets, the production of scales, that is, the scale from the body through the region and the nation to the globe. So this is the different producing scales at these levels. The control of movement within and across different kinds of boundaries and so on. Pyle and Keith, 1997. Yet, those being dominated contest that space of and for domination. The configurations for produced space produced by the dominating power, both in the physical and mental forms, are something to be crushed and overcome by those controlled. The state and monetary power configures relational space, or the space of quote unquote disjointed unity, as at once fragmentary and homogeneous, as Lefebvre. The struggle between the dominant and the dominated triggers oppressed people to create alternative configuration of space through putting up resistance, inaugurating a counter space. Now, you could argue that the unhoused or the homeless are function in that kind of way, albeit in a very small and individual scale, but within the confines of usually a city. Therefore, there is an inherent dialectic in the subsumed space. The political power, which holds sway over quote unquote men, although it dominates the space occupied by its quote unquote subjects, does not control the causes and reasons that intersect within that space, each of which acts by and for itself. It's Lefebvre. Therefore, the domination of the power over space exacerbates the conflict inherent in the political arena and in the state per se, and promotes a political critique which lends its weight to the trend towards the self-destruction of the moment of politics. There's a lot there to unpack. The power thus cannot subsume space entirely. Contrarily, space can enhance the contradiction of the dominion, or the contradiction of the domination. Contrarily, space can enhance the contradiction of the domination and becomes a tool for emancipation. Resistance is, quote, in Pyle and Keith's words, the people fighting back in defense of freedom, democracy, and humanity in space. The actions for resistance take place through specific geographies. You can argue that, for example, in the Paris Commune, for example. Consequently, in a class society, the configuration of space becomes always class specific. Different layers of space controlled by different classes in society overlap. State power, or in Lefebvre's example, the pater rex, later imperator, father king, thus reconstituted the space around him as the space of power. That is, the representation of space. On the other hand, representational spaces would develop. Women, servants, slaves, children all have their own spaces. So you could say, for example, in Downton Abbey or upstairs, downstairs, there is a whole space in which the servants move as opposed to the landed property owners, the family. So And they exist in parallel and, often do not interact in that kind of way. The configuration of space thus becomes dialectical, infused with struggles. It contains a brutal condensation of social relationships, Lefebvre, or to use Lefebvre's terminology, pratique spéciale. Inasmuch as global space bears the inscriptions and prescriptions of power, the struggle ensues from the contradiction and conflicts in the social relationships, attempting to create an alternative space of their own. Lefebvre stated that the knowledge of space has a prospective import, which is the project of another space and another time in another society. Here, another space has dual implications. First, it's the alternative configuration of space, or as we noted, the term counter space. Second, space can be deployed for the struggle to attain another society. As you can see, sort of implicated here is the ideal of, sort of utopian ideas, people having alternative things. You create your own cult or, whatever. These things occur, that attempts to create autonomy in a variety of ways. Some for, as we've seen, white supremacist reasons, etc. In this chapter, I deal with both in turn. 9.2, section 9.2, the dominant space of power versus the counter space of the people. Subsection A, abstract space. Remember, we're looking at abstract space, relative space, and relational space. Abstract space, the spaces of the dominant power. The capitalist and state power colonize the space of ordinary citizens. Lefebvre conceptualized the confrontation and the production of space by stating that, quote, the new social relationships call for a new space, and vice versa, explicitly giving spatial irradiation to the conflicting social relations. The representation of the space, la représentation de l'espace, or the space of the dominant power, produced through contesting the space of representation, l'espace de représentation, which is the space of the daily biological reproduction of ordinary citizens. The space of power superimposes itself over that of the daily lives of laborers and families, the daily lives of laborers and families. This confrontation arises in two contrasting issues, that is, abstract space and concrete space. Note that we talked about this more, about abstract and concrete, relations, and they, unfold in a space. So there's an abstract space and a concrete space, and a representation. This is the second issue, a representation of space and the space of a representation, which are not identical, right? You have a representation of space, and you have the space created or determined by a representation. So these are two differing ways, and in fact, they can be contrasted in the other issue, that is as abstract or concrete. So hopefully you haven't lost there. The abstraction of abstract space, this espace abstrait, derives from Abstract Human Labor in Capitals, Volume 1. Abstract human labor crystallizes in impersonal monetary power, which create the space of private ownership through land use coordination and a market economy. Such a thorough process of commercialization and bureaucratization of space, while mutually reinforcing, organizes the relational space and the built environment as a space of exchange value. In the representation of space, the process of monetization and the dominant power or bureaucracy are inscribed in the built environment. The bureaucracy conducts systematic monitoring and control over space and inscribes the configuration of relational space in the built environment, which manifests legal and political organization of society onto pristine space. Recall the construction of space as, pristine, and then, sort of it becomes more real, so to speak. The technologies of civil and urban engineering, architecture, and city planning are projected here to legitimize the dominant economic and social order. This is exactly the ideology that supports the production of abstract space through the intervention of capitalist economy as well as the state power. The representation of space is therefore the configuration of space formalized and framed by the dominant power and the relations of production. The space thus produced by state power or bureaucracy is polymerized onto abstract space. Polymerized, that's an interesting way to think about it. In these spaces, ordered and formalized by monetary and state power, space no longer a simple container of living beings, of the living being. It shackles those, fetter in that sense, it shackles those who seek alternative representation of space. Now, you can argue this in a variety of historical ways, and you can talk about it as, homesteading and land rushes and or eminent domain, or there's a whole bunch of other little ways you could talk about this as the operations of dominant power within a space. So anyway, subsection B, counter space, counter-space, pursuit for escaping the territory under domination. And lest you think that's unimportant, there's whole narratives about, jurisdictional power, right? I can't chase them because it's in another county, and getting over the county line or entering over a county line becomes more like that. That's that whole, with all due respect, Southern sheriff trope that occurs. Anyway. And yes, sheriff sovereignty and all that is sort of part of this idea that, you have sort of local domination as opposed to regional domination or national domination. The term concrete space emerges here. It is derived from concrete useful labor that constitutes use value, that is utility. This is the space of the representation which critically observes the representation of the space. So remember, we're looking at the difference between space of the representation and the representation of the space, because it's kind of, two sides of a coin, perhaps, or two sides of a two-way mirror, and gives a way to intervene in opposition to it. The alternative configuration of space can be produced through such contesting actions of the people as, quote, dislocations through, for example, frictions of distance, the blurring of boundaries, and hiding and coming out, close quote. Pyle and Keith, 97, I guess. The simplest way to escape domination is just to leave the territory dominated by the power. Yeah, get the hell out of there. The ancient Nara period of Japan, when those who could not endure serfdom gradually escaped to estates owned privately by nobles, Buddhist temples, or shrines, was explained in chapter 3. Consequently, the imperial court lost the villeins, that is, sort of the financial obligations that supported it economically, and it collapsed. So this is, how you're going to get the tithe or whatever, that set of relations, and it becomes problematic because some people overstep their bounds and try to, demand too much, or In the case of Braveheart, somebody decides that, well, when anyone gets to be married, the Lord of the Manor gets the first night. That's a kind of thing that brings these things to an end ultimately. In short, if the contiguity of absolute space and the propensity of the homogenizing process enable the spatial migration of the people. And speaking of Braveheart, this is, there's lots of migrations, Scottish migrations and all land seizures and all kinds of other stuff, clearing. It puts the dominating power on the verge of collapse. It's the consequence of the dialectics between formally subsumed absolute space and the power or market. And the negative property of physical contiguity, which absolute space brings into the economic and societal power. So on the one hand, you have, things that are determined more abstractly, you could say, in terms of power. And then you have the space itself, and often, defined by, land features, or, that, you create kind of natural, quote unquote, boundaries or whatever. However, this primitive strategy of deploying the unsubsumed property of pristine space in an alternative way is readily suppressed once the power manages to establish a higher order scale and puts that scale under its domination, as discussed in Chapter 5. Subsection C struggles to establish a counterspace of the people. In cases where multi-scalar configuration of power domination is in place, movements to recover a firmer counterspace of daily life as a representational space arise from those dominated by the power through spatial praxis. This social action is essential since groups, classes, or fractions of classes cannot constitute themselves or recognize one another as subjects unless they generate or produce space. The most immediate version of that, of course, is, you put your coat down on a chair, I suppose, when you come into a room that has a meeting and chairs and tables, etc. You begin to produce space. You produce space when you sort of say, this is where I want to sit. And then there are, of course, people who would violate that and who are quite nuts. But I would assert that we've all come in contact with people who don't quite have it together, or who have other kinds of psychiatric issues at work. It's just odd, people get used to riding in the same seat on the, if you're commuting on the train or whatever, and they think it's their spot. Well, it's not really their spot. If they get there first, it's their spot. But if they haven't really marked it and someone just decides, I'm going to sit here, and what's psychotic is people who actually get bent out of shape. This is my seat, whatever. When it's not clearly allocated, like on an airplane as opposed to a train, for example. Some trains. Anyway, the counter space is an alternative configuration of space which arises from everyday struggles, including secret and illegal aspects in social life based on the autogenous bond with space as experienced by the subservient people. The counter space is lived space set as the base for the opposition. It offers an opportunity to criticize and intervene in the process of configuring the relational space and the built environment. Probably the cruder version of this, of course, is a child's treehouse, for example. The people must turn back state power through the production of counter plans and counter projects designed to thwart strategies, plans, and programs imposed from above, that is, the dominating class. So there is a clubhouse sort of nature that sort of goes on here, right? The counter space earmarks initially what is excluded, that is, the edges of the city, shanty towns, the spaces of forbidden games of guerrilla war or of war itself. If no counterattack is mounted from those under domination, these excluded spaces are likely to be homogenized and absorbed. Counterattacks must therefore be waged to show those in power that they do have limits to integrate, to recuperate, to destroy the space that has been excluded. You post no trespassing, or, and in the case of the state or the government or the military, deadly force is authorized, whatever. Then the counter project emerges to promote a counter space in opposition to the one embodied in the strategies of power. The counter space inserts itself against, for example, power and the arrogance of power, endless expansion of private and of industrial profitability. The counter space can also function as the container of local powers, creating independent territorial entities capable to some degree of self-management. And lest you think that that's unimportant, some of that goes on in, for example, the Magnificent Seven has that as a subtext, or the OK Shootout at the OK Corral has that kind of element to it, or certain other kinds of movies, sort of altercations or confrontations within a frontier space. The struggle is thus fought between the power that colonized and dominated space and the people whose space has been colonized and peripheralized. Unless you think that's unimportant, that's kind of what's going on right now, in like the Caribbean, for example, or Africa. The people thus stand up to produce counter space or territories of local powers. Failing this struggle, the dominated space will simply be weakened. The people oppressed under domination thus challenge the restrictive divisions and the dominant configurations of relational space and the built environment. An extraordinary spatial duality would ensue then as a spatial manifestation of the, quote, duality of political power, unquote. Here, the contradictions of society simply emerge in space, at the level of space, and so engender the contradictions of space. The objective of the struggle is to recover and regenerate the concrete space of daily life, or the counter space from the abstract space generated by the monetization of society and the rampant inflection of state power. Now, we should not belittle the struggles to create counter space, since they shake existing space to its foundations along with its strategies and aims. And of course, shake the existing power structure that the spatial struggle is fighting. And I guess an example would be when certain powers that be, attempt to clear homeless, for example, homeless sites or spaces for a variety of reasons, whether to move them away for alternative reasons or simply to exercise power. The physical power of the built environment as a representation of space imposes itself on the people as a manifestation of political power. The struggle in space appears as the opposition between conventional and counter versions, conventional versions and counter versions of the spatial configuration, as well as the built environment, which in itself contains the duality of the contiguity and separation. So, skateboarders on the weekend want to take over civic entities, or the downtown or whatever, certain sites, and this is that tension between the two, for whatever reason, and of course, whether it is or isn't a crime, whatever. Thus, the theory of the subsumption of space, as put forward in the previous chapters, develops into a theory of spatial struggle, placing two different versions of the relational space and the built environment in opposing axes if the alternative space is to be successfully defended. These opposing axes are the focus of resistance and struggle for counter space and become the source of the space of representation. Seen from the homogenizing power of the dominant, the struggle means to create differences from the dominating space, and in preceding it, to ensure the right of struggle to create the spatial difference, which implies no entitlements that do not have to be bitterly fought for. So Feb. Section 9.3, struggles around absolute space, part 1, contiguity and bounding. Remember, we talked about contiguity and separation, etc. Subsection A, the pursuit of contiguity. That is, a contiguity describes a kind of adjacency. It's one that, you could call it mathematical. It is just simply logical. Something next to, it's something adjacent to something. Something is contiguous to something else. Space for liberation and realization, as discussed in Chapter 3, the property of unlimited contiguity of absolute space that embraces every subject is homologous, is structurally similar to the ideal of universal human rights as represented in the slogan of the French Revolution, that is liberty, equality, equality, and fraternity. Now, the strategic objectives here is, as Lefebvre states, reunification of what has been split apart. So the other here is the opposition, contrast is between contiguity and separation. Back to the text. The network that the dominating power produce is shared by the people as well. This is one of the empowering effects of absolute space, giving rise to a certain kind of dialectics, Paris Commune, I guess. The proliferation of denser networks sometimes weakens the state power since it reduces isolation and offers the people an opportunity for empowerment by creating a counter network of communication across space, as in the case of the internet, right? Social media can create these things. Whence the clamor raised on all sides by those who want to loosen the grip of power, to decentralize, to manage or self-manage from the grassroots. This Lefebvre, through the expansion of alternative action across space, through this alternative use of the network, the state's tendency to establish centers of decision, armed with all the tools of power and subordinated to a single main center, the capital, thus encounters stiff resistance. And you can see how that does or can operate in that particular context in social media. There are examples of civil society organizations seeking empowering contiguity. The coalition of member groups, like the Right to the City Alliance of New York, sought their definition of public space, that they can not only truly access so-called public space, but can also be empowered to create new common spaces for socialization and political action, with David Harvey, 2012. That is, the citizens' aim to grab power to produce commons that can be utilized by everyone should be a condition for emancipation. Now, that's, not clearly spelled out, and particularly in the kind of rules that you create for urban areas, et cetera, or civic areas. Some global NGOs, non-governmental organizations, expand their action space to the global scale so that they can actually share global common space with the multinational enterprises for their counteractions. Here are two examples with different configuration of spatial scale. Now, Greenpeace, a civil society organization for environmental protection, has been active globally on a wide range of environmental problems, from global warming to product liability of vinyl chloride toys, sometimes deploying illegal force and relying on the financial donations and funds from innumerable citizens concerned about the environment. Recall, of course, that Greenpeace has a spinoff, or created a spinoff, or Watson created a spinoff of Sea Shepherd, for example. Overcoming the fragmented systems of domestic laws and confronting environmental destruction by, for example, multinational enterprises on a global spatial scale, Greenpeace embraces the global action space and reminds multinational enterprises seeking to invest in areas least resistant to environmental pollution that there is no longer any spatial fix for the predatory use of the environment by confronting them globally. That's, Greenpeace does that. Sea Shepherd is much more activist in that particular context. That is, deliberately or physically creating obstructions for Japanese whaling ships, for example, or, and doing a variety of actions that resemble that, and attempting not to use deadly force, but rather a kind of disobedient force, obstruction that sort of still sits within the international law. Another civil society organization is the Kalaba no Kai for poverty-stricken citizens in the neighborhood of Kotobuki in Yokohama. This society, whose official appellation is Association in Kotobuki for Solidarity with Migrant Workers, continues to support international workers residing there, some of whom have no valid employment visas. You can see already that's problematic. And that's the kind of thing that you send ICE out in this country for. This association may seem to work at a local spatial scale, unlike Greenpeace. Yet its standpoint is actually very important here. Standpoint is firmly at the scale of global contiguity. It questions why the action space allowed for the elite of multinational enterprise is off limits to simple laborers. No shirt, no shoes, no service. The Kalaba no Kai aims at a globalism which universally empowers the human right to spread the action space to seek jobs over the global space, and has had positive results in the struggle to empower international laborers to have the right of action space. And you can see this operative in contracted migrant workers. You get all these Filipinos to come to, Saudi Arabia or whatever, and they have space, but in some ways they have no space, or they need to create, spaces in that sense. Aside from the working, the functional elements of that. Therefore, just like Greenpeace, Kalaba no Kai pursues a strong alternative to the global continuity of space created by multinational capital and the power of the nation states. It also provides an empowering consultation service by volunteers to international laborers to establish contiguity in international labor migration with the universal human rights of workers guaranteed. In other words, some people, you go to a country and you go on a one kind of visa, and then you stay, you overstay or whatever and seek work. And, half the battle is, at Customs and Border Protection is to try and separate out people who are just there to visit, or, for a variety of reasons, family or tourism or whatever, and those who simply want to, make some money and reestablish themselves to technically homestead in that sense. In short, back to the text, the action space for neoliberalism and the spatial configuration created by it having spread globally to subsume the global scale, the action space of the people in opposition should not be confined to the local scale. It should advance the movement on the scale of global contiguity to struggle at the same global scale. And you can see the resistance to that, or the manipulation of that idea of global contiguity by, taking people who are undocumented migrants or whatever, and not just simply returning them to their home country, or the country from which they entered or whatever, but rather to someplace completely different and a continent away, simply because it's about the cruelty. It's about, that this is a disincentive to do any more of this, and we're going to keep you in your place. And to do that, we're going to force you to take even a longer trip or whatever. And, that's that's kind of the way, in a normal way and in a very efficient way, it occurred during some American administrations. There's a tremendous amount of deportation activity that was relatively efficient and uh, less cruel, let's put it that way. Whereas in the current situation, it's about the cruelty. It's just about screwing with people. Anyway, so it is necessary. Spatial contiguity empowering self-realization, subsection B. It is necessary for those seeking alternatives to break the isolation created by bounding and the containment of social action to a limited territory inscribed by those holding power to empower themselves through grabbing the universal and contiguous spread of the global space back to themselves through their actions. At one time, all people on Earth enjoyed the contiguity of the global space without visas or passports, right? You just get in your boat and go somewhere. Humans in the Stone Age could expand territory or action space provided there was a physical and technical means of space integration. Such universal contiguity is derived from the property of pristine, absolute space of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which makes space as a field that realizes self-realization, right? After people became confined into territories under oppression and controlled by power, they were deprived of this freedom, as the global space had been divided by the state power, nation states, et cetera, et cetera. The people can, however, get back their freedom and empowerment once they recover the spatial contiguity in some form and dare to overcome containment to the division set by the state power. Contiguity, therefore, works for the empowerment of those who are oppressed and for gaining political and social leverage towards their liberation. For example, when the Hungarian government opened its border with Austria, the citizens of former East Germany, oppressed under the Stalinist SED, the socialist the Socialist Unity Party of Germany regime, the SED regime, were able to acquire the contiguity of Europe that had been blocked by the quote unquote Iron Curtain, all right, the Cold War Iron Curtain. This contiguity eventually led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and put an end to the oppressive Stalinist regimes in Eastern Europe. There was a certain fluidity or deterioration or erosion of travel back and forth over a border, despite putting, a kind of huge wall in Berlin and et cetera. Eventually, this becomes eroded, and everyone decides they're going to walk over the border, and no one stops them for X number of reasons. The strategy of securing or restoring contiguity by the people and establishing it more clearly as an instrument for struggle is now taking place in various ways as a movement for emancipation. In this context, Harvey pressed home the strategy for the populations to self-organize to provide their own commons. Now, this is actually an anarchist idea in some ways, grabbing back and extending and enhancing the qualities of the non-commodified, reproductive, and environmental commons is a political struggle which has to be integrated wholly into anti-capitalist struggle in a very specific way. This is problematic for all kinds of reasons, but this is how some people operate. Subsection C, the tragedy of the commons, and the concept of Gesamteigentum. Gesamteigentum. The Roman legal system presumes the existence of private economic subjects and a market where bounded space and the individualization of territory were imposed by the state power. On the other hand, the Germanic legal system recognized the right of sharing the contiguous space as Gesamteigentum. That is collective ownership. As an example of this type of ownership is the right of the members of a village community to share the forest wilderness which lay within their action space. However, The contemporary legal system with respect to space has been established based on the Roman system, and the right to the commons has been denied by many state powers. So you can see the conflict there. And, Marx, began his sort of concern for these matters in the Silesian miners' struggle, whatever it was that, and connected with that was the fact that loose branches and wood that you would find out, walking around, that you would use for cooking, for fire, for heat, was you could be prosecuted for picking up these, loose pieces of wood. This law does exist in a variety of places in a variety of contexts in Europe, that you shouldn't be carrying loose wood around. An example of this type of ownership, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, the contemporary legal system with respect to space has been established based on the Roman system, and the right to the commons is denied by many state powers. If the rights of space are subsumed straight into the market economy, where each economic subject is independent and competes with others, it causes a contradiction of what Garrett Hardin called the tragedy of the commons. Now, neoclassical economists love the metaphor to deny the viability of the commons. Yet David Harvey aptly criticized that if the cattle were held in common, of course, the metaphor would not work. See, this is a kind of libertarian contradiction of the tragedy of the commons. This shows that it is private property and cattle and individual utility maximizing behavior that lie at the heart of the problem, rather than the common property character of the resource. This is this issue of, I should be able to do whatever I want with my property, whatever. This is no different in private property and cattle than in beauty pageants, for example. The owner should be able to go behind the scenes in the dressing rooms and ogle the contestants or whatever. Therefore, for multiple entities with collective rights to restore the contiguity of space as the commons, the alternative social system of reciprocity and redistribution within a community of outcomes using collective space must be installed and implemented. So we're looking at an alternative social system of reciprocity and redistribution within a community of outcomes using collective space. Once the principle of reciprocity has been installed as a legal provision, society does not require the bounded mosaic of territories for each subject as in the market economy. For example, if the rules for the use of commons are set clear and the people concerned work cooperatively, that's the important word, then the resources in the quote-unquote grand bank are available, where spatial contiguity reigns. The alternative society indeed makes the alternative mode of subsuming space possible. Subsection D, overcoming the fetishism of separation and fragmentation created by the power. Space is more often prohibitions, and most such prohibitions are invisible. This is Lefebvre. The divided space of discrimination, isolation, and prohibition that has been imposed by the state and capitalist power must be denied and restructured to restore emancipation from imposed division. This is the key to empowerment. The action of political power, which creates fragmentation and so controls it, which create it, indeed, in order to control it. In the contemporary world, the barriers confining people within the territory of their respective scale are mostly under rigid management by the authority dominating the fragmented territories. Ethnic groups who happen to be confined in a certain territory at the national scale, regardless of their will, are placed in the status of minority ethnic groups under the divided territory, where their potential to exercise their human rights is rather impaired or disempowering. In urban space, the minorities and the poor are spatially contained. And this containment is generated by the compulsion of the built environment. In gated communities, wealthy people separate themselves with a high wall and a guarded gate through which only residents can pass. The strategy of voluntarily regaining the contiguity of the space from those oppressed people through involuntary confinement will not be realized without overcoming the artificial separation imposed by the dominant power, which has colonized the space or their daily life and labor reproduction. Ironically, however, the subjects or groups of the people in the dominated territory actively seek to separate the territory in some cases. It is sometimes an effective means to relinquish the domination by creating at the same spatial scale their own territory, which functions as a node for constructing alternative autonomy. There are many such cases in Europe undergoing the process, as in Scotland and Catalonia, or that have been already materialized, as in Kosovo, to obtain separation and establish a new state where the hegemony of existing higher order state power can no longer exercise domination. Now, from the side of those oppressed, it's certainly necessary to relativize the existing systems and claim legitimacy of spatial configurations, including the fetishism of bounding and territory, which are institutionalized or take a physical or imaginary form. Now, through these efforts, the people can consciously overcome the fetishism and explicitly re-examine the legitimacy of separation. Overcoming the fetishism by rethinking one's everyday routine is the first step to defetishize the absolute legitimacy of the existing multi-layered spatial configuration. The fetishism of border and territory, as it has all been taken for granted in everyday consciousness, must be overcome. You know, if you put up a wall or a set of fencing or whatever, people are supposed to, recognize it or acknowledge it or whatever. But, at some moment, it can be defeated in that context. Laborers who cross borders without a valid working visa are recognized and treated undoubtedly as, quote unquote, illegal immigrants by the power dominating either side of the border. However, the border of a national territory, including the superimposed boundaries, is indeed a product of the state power as a political artifact, not something natural and absolutely given, such as the delineations of rivers and mountains. By creating a national border, it even defines the ethnic minority groups incorporated into the territory circumscribed by the border as a quote-unquote minority whose protection is to be carried out only through emphasizing ethnic identity and heritage, right? The southern border of the United States, which is supposedly closed, but it isn't. People go to work every day across the border. The border is never natural or eternal. Its legitimacy should be duly questioned and fought against through various forms of struggle. As a way of struggle, those confined within a border of a state and capitalist power need to construct a system of counterspace of their own. The counterspace, thus generated spontaneously from those oppressed after overcoming the fetishism of space, relativizes the existing division. For example, the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, which has seen many ethnic groups labeled as minorities, turned some minorities into majorities, and former majorities, such as the Hungarian and German-speaking Austrians, became minorities in places like Transylvania, Romania, and South Tyrol after the dissolution of the empire. After all, minorities are nothing more than the products of historical contingency. Therefore, a strategy here is to relativize the fetishism of bounding created by the state power and formalize the autogenously created territories, made under the long-term association of the social group in space more explicitly by the power of former minority people. That's the issue of the Southwest since I guess the early in the last century, probably during the same time as the Great Migration. International borders after World War II were consolidated under the domination of the UN, but this has resulted only in the form of segmentation of existing independent states observed in the former Yugoslavia and the former Soviet Union. Yet some ethnic groups, such as the Irish in Northern Ireland, insist on annexation of their territory to the country where the same ethnic group dominates as the majority. This is the whole issue of, and problematized, of course, by Brexit, the difference between Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. A solution to the ethnic problem and the realization of self-determination can be found only in the spatial strategy of a fundamental reshuffling of existing national borders, as actually happened after World War I in Europe, and as Kwame Nkrumah demanded for an independent Africa. The whole issue of neocolonialism, post-colonialism, etc., is made more difficult, of course, by people who really understand that it's much larger than simply, just simply putting in new borders for the, but retaining all the colonial kind of power structures. 9.4, struggles around absolute space, part 2. The dialectics between Wirkungsraum and action space. So you can see Wirkungsraum and emancipatory action space, as suggested in the previous section, territories created of the real subsumption of absolute space fall into either of two types, which have distinct properties and contradict one another. Wirkungsraum is the kind of space which needs state power, or sometimes the power of the occupants themselves, to ensure exclusive occupation of a territory. Without power, the territories are always vulnerable to trespassing and to be taken over by others. By contrast, action space is a type of space not controlled much by the dominant power, but more anarchical, fluid, and laissez-faire, controlled only by the physical property of pristine space. As summarized, remember I talked about table 9.1, action space is more amenable to the production of counter space by allowing more anarchical, flexible, and spontaneous human actions not controlled by the dominant power, whereas Wirkungsraum is more institutionalized, controlled, and created by the explicit political process of bounding. Once created, the boundary of a territory forms an iron frame, quote unquote, where free human actions are negated or constrained. The boundary of action space is set by a physical distance decay effect where interaction over space diminishes with the inverse square of the distance, while the boundary of Wirkungsraum is set by a political process backed by state power. So it has, it can be a redistrict in that sense. Action space lacks the concept of trespassing. Instead, it has property close to the commons, as different agents share a territory, and more than one action space can overlap with another. Therefore, action space is more empowering. While for Wirkungsraum, exclusive occupation and the ownership of a territory protected by power is the norm. The owner or occupier dominates the territory, and trespassing by outsiders is subject to prosecution. So, as I mentioned yesterday, and as I indicated before I started yakking here, the table 9.1 is a comparison of action space and Wirkungsraum. It's Mizuoka's table, and it has a kind of similar kind of structure to it, certain contrasts, and clearly one's defined by space, are more spatial in that sense. So it's kind of drilling down from the more ideological differences that we saw in the other, the comparison of Fordism and neoliberalism. So looking at the columns, that there's bounding, repeated spatial act versus repeated spatial actions, no trespassing free, no constraints on trespassing, whereas trespassing, and prosecution are created. And you create this kind of difference, power domination and constraints on one hand, a homogeneous configuration, whereas empowerment and freedom are much more nodal. There's hubs and spokes and, networks and a variety of other things, paths and projects, whatever. So in sum, action space is less institutionalized, but more emancipatory, whereas Wirkungsraum, or bounded territories, is more fixed and coercive. B, the dialectics of Wirkungsraum and action space in social struggles. Various action spaces come together in different types of spatial scales. The scale of metropolitan areas is formed by such factors as daily commuting and shopping ranges, range of longer-term labor migration, and the habitat of an ethnic group or groups of people using a common language. Among these scales emerge many vertical interscalar relations. Some scales are almost totally dependent upon higher order ones, as in the relationship between the state and the jurisdiction of local states, towns, regions, etc. Yet others are more independent and contradictory in relation to other scales. A typical socio-spatial dialectic comes out of the contradiction between spontaneous action space and institutionalized Wirkungsraum. A bounded territory institutionalized by the dominant power is always exposed to fresh challenges from the actions embedded in the more pristine property of absolute space. People act beyond the spatial range of institutionalized boundaries, either out of ignorance or explicit intention. Action space can therefore erode and undermine the domination of power exercised in the bounded territory. It's really the story of most motion picture westerns, right? It is these contradictions or problems, right? The difference between sheep herders or cattle, ranchers and farmers or whatever. A more anarchical and spontaneous action space thereby creates opportunities of empowerment or to challenge the dominant power represented in the institutionalized Wirkungsraum. Now, while those in power attempt to impede the freer action of agency or socioeconomic flows by controlling the porosity of the territorial iron frame grid, the people may attempt to continue their actions by breaking through this frame and penetrating the boundary, often without authorization. There's a movie whose name I can't remember, of the immediate period right after World War II, when the boundaries in Soviet-occupied East Germany are differentiated or kind of contested with the Western Allied powers. I mean, they're all Allied powers, but particularly the Soviets decided, they would do certain things, and in certain cases, it becomes more problematic. The exclusiveness and boundedness of the territory and the authority over it are thereby undermined. This process is more detrimental to the authority because it can lead to the collapse of the dominant power contained in the institutionalized territory itself. The subordinated class, ethnic group, or individual can intentionally deploy the contradiction between Wirkungsraum and action space to create les espaces de représentation for its struggle against the authority, space of representation. The struggling agent may form a united front based on the common nature and spatialized oppression to engage in collective actions, while in other cases, it may be more disintegrated, as in the individualized laborers in the labor market acting across action space rationally to maximize their income. We saw a little bit of that in the divisions of spaces that occurred in, for example, Italy in the movie 1900, the differences between those who are hired to be on the land and those who have some stake in the land, etc. Anyway, ironically, many of these individual cases come out of the rational economic behavior of agents following the fundamentalist market economists. For example, in some spaces, illegal immigration seeks higher income or contraband trade for higher prices, drug smugglers, which are considered punishable by the laws enforced by the dominant power, including that of a neoliberalist type. Gee, such free mobility comes into conflict with the state power that places an undue burden on the free mobility of labor or goods based on the rational, laissez-faire behavior of the people. A typical case related to immigration is the flow of Chinese labor in pursuit of higher incomes from the PRC, People's Republic of China, to British Hong Kong without authorization from the British colonial authority in the 1960s and 70s. An example relating to contraband is the cross-border import of daily necessities from Thailand to Burma, where goods for daily consumption are in short supply for a variety of reasons. Corruption, just poor economic organization, differential markets, different class structures, the imposition of certain types of authorities against other types of authorities, etc. These actions of the people spontaneously alter the configuration of the territory imposed by the state power. The proliferation of these action spaces eventually undermines the territories institutionalized by power and the very authority that survived by deploying the iron frame as its container would collapse. This social spatial struggle is clearly demonstrated by the pan-European picnic on the Hungarian border in 1989. The pressure generated by thousands of East Germans gathering spontaneously led to the opening up of the border fence with Austria. This allowed East Germans to flee from the institutionalized wall that had confined them into the iron frame, and it split their potential action space. The collapse of the Stalinist regime of the GDR, East Germany, immediately after this quote-unquote picnic, also demonstrates clearly the significance of counteraction deploying action space from the produced spatial iron frame to the emancipation-seeking society. Section 9.5 struggles around relative space. Counter-agglomeration, counter-networks, and stray spaces. So, introduction. So how can we get a territorial foothold of counter space in the existing space? The distance decay effect dictates that the longer the distance, the weaker the strength of social interactions, including power. This effect can be exploited by contesting social groups in two ways. First, people belonging to an alienated and subservient social group can empower themselves through agglomeration, physical living, or acting closer together. This is the spatial rationale for the emergence of urban districts comprising people of particular ethnic or sexual identities, right? Chinatown, whatever. The ghetto. The agglomeration of people from the group brings about the creation and consolidation of their internal network and political power, and hence empowers them and strengthens their social position. Second, there can be a pristine space that has not been subsumed by the spatial network produced by the dominant power. Subservient people may find a space in a weak grip and deploy it as an element of an alternative spatial configuration. In Lefebvre's terminology, quote-unquote, deviant or diverted spaces, categorized in this book as stray spaces, can be created. Stray space serves as an important element in producing l'espace de représentation. Since stray spaces are out of bounds of the iron frame of the institutionalized territory, subordinated social groups can escape domination and deploy power intentionally to secretly develop an alternative agglomeration to aid their struggle. Now, this can take the form of a hidden liberated zone that serves as a launching pad for engaging in national or global insurgencies against authorities. Gaza, right? In this sense, counter-agglomeration and stray spaces serve as important elements in producing l'espace de représentation. The effectiveness of the production of such a space for a struggle depends on the strength of the state's spatial grip as well as, ironically enough, on the ability of the subordinate group to pay monopoly rent. Now, this argument here is an interesting one, and well, we can talk about that later. B, agglomeration is a spatial strategy for empowerment. Agglomeration is the physical annihilation of space to eliminate the effect of distance decay. Oppressed people living close together facilitate the creation of a denser network with nodes for communication and exchange. Due to its sheer size, the agglomeration occupies a certain expanse of territory as a quote-unquote liberated zone within which a territory of self-reliance and autonomy is created. This can lead to the creation of a source of power, as discussed in Section 2 of Chapter 3, and a spontaneous bond between the body and space. Manuel Castells, 1983, depicted the positive role of agglomeration in his research on the creation of a gay territory in the Castro district of San Francisco. He stated, when gay men try to liberate themselves from cultural and sexual oppression, they need a physical space from which to strike out. Now, this also has to do with class, but that's a whole nother idea. For gay people, a network is essential to find sexual partners, which requires nodes such as gay bars. Around the 1970s, relatively wealthy gay households began to agglomerate in the middle of urban San Francisco. Now, this was possible because of their wealth, which allowed them to afford the monopoly rent, right? Monopoly rent. This was necessary in order to override the pre-existing property ownership of the urban districts where they desired to live. Their wealth also contributed to the gentrification of their territory. This is kind of where it is now. On the contrary, lesbians did not agglomerate. Presumably, because of the non-affordability of monopoly rent due to their income constraints. So there's clearly gender and class have, interlocking constraints. The resulting gay community in San Francisco empowered the residents since the district coincided with supervisorial District 5, from which the prominent gay statesman Harvey Milk was elected. Note, of course, that we're in a reactionary phase, and Harvey Milk's name, even though he was, a decorated veteran, was stripped from a ship. Simply because he's gay. I mean, there's no other reason for stripping it. This is the whole anti-DEI stuff. Counter-agglomeration thereby enhances the position of oppressed groups in society, creating space for emancipation and giving them the freedom to pursue an alternative way of life. Counter-agglomeration not only ensures their survival, but can also eventually lead to the accumulation of the power necessary to mobilize and change the government. Nevertheless, the affordability of monopoly rent is a key condition for the materialization of this strategy in existing urban areas. Subsection C, alternative networks for struggle. The need for physical agglomeration has waned recently with the development of remote modes of interaction through the internet. Indeed, the internet arises from a spatial network that covers a wide spatial range and totally annihilates time. The network can be shared by both dominant and non-dominant people. If the network cannot be shared, those struggling against authority need to build their own networks to materialize their objectives. With this move towards building an alternative transport network, people can now materialize their own action spaces. The subordinated people may need an alternative network of spatial integration that covers a longer spatial range. In this case, those struggling against the authority may need to build their own transport network to materialize their own objectives. Now, an example of this alternative network is the Underground Railroad, the underground train that functioned in the Civil War era in the U.S. It transported blacks from the southern slave states to the industrial North, where the slaves were liberated and converted into industrial labor for manufacturing plants run by northern capitalists, or people would escape to Canada. Another example is the Ho Chi Minh Trail, connecting the People's Republic of China, North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and South Vietnam to transport ammunition and other military supplies for the National Liberation Front and the NLF in South Vietnam, then dominated by a U.S. puppet regime. Some parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail accommodated military lorries, yet others only bicycles, together forming a sophisticated network connecting North Vietnam with various quote unquote liberated zones in the south. With this network of the trails, the Vietnamese people managed to oust the US from Vietnam. Compared with the means to integrate space produced by the state power, counter-transport networks such as these are often shabbily built, since the subordinated do not have sufficient funds to construct a durable transport infrastructure. Nevertheless, these counter networks have been indispensable and essential for the people in undermining the dominant power. Subsection D, stray space arising from the primitive means of spatial integration. The network of the Ho Chi Minh Trail was built through the tropical jungles in Laos and Cambodia, which were mostly out of the reach of the ground U.S. armed forces on the ground. The effectiveness of such a network with nodal bases for the struggle depends on the strength of the spatial grip by the state power, as well as the skill and craft of the subordinated groups to hide such an emancipatory base from the authorities' surveillance. All the tunnels, right? Tunnels in Vietnam, tunnels in Gaza, etc. In the past, when the technology to achieve surveillance over space was primitive, this space, out of the reach of surveillance by the state power, was the ubiquitous element of space in many countries. For example, in former Manchukuo, currently the northeastern part of China, Manchukuo, the central government at Xinjiang, currently Changchun, would never achieve perfect domination of the peripheral mountain areas under the state power. The areas along the Soviet border were typically subject to infiltration by partisans engaged in the anti-Japanese struggle. In the remote mountainous areas in Malaysia and Thailand until the 1960s, inspired by the Chinese Revolution and the strategy of Mao Zedong, communist rebels established centers of struggle in the northern border areas, aiming to launch communist revolution in these countries. Today, the possibility of finding stray space exists only in countries where the government is defunct or surveillance and control over the territory by state power is dysfunctional. So a good example is Somalia and the Horn of Africa. For insurgent groups of valuable space, which offers a rare global stray space to establish their alternative centers for waging counterattacks on the globally dominant neoliberalist power. They're still hijacking ships, right? This is the very reason that the neoconservatives have labeled such countries a failed state, or as Trump calls them, shithole countries, right? And attempted to place them under political domination akin to colonial rule, as in the case of Afghanistan. Stray space can arise out of the paradox of spatial integration. Some parts of a territory are bound to be left out from the networks of transportation and communication. The higher the speed at which transport technology is designed to move humans and goods, the more severe the spatial unevenness of the network becomes. The parts of territory left out of real subsumption thus remain imperfectly controlled by the dominant power. This aggravating unevenness means differences in the intensity of domination by the power in a bounded territory. That is, the core area can be firmly under authority, while domination in the periphery may be weaker. This kind of like, I guess, Brazil. Even though the dominant power attempts to extend its hold over every corner of the territory, the level of funds required to make the network denser to accomplish successful surveillance over entire territory may be prohibitive. Due to this imperfect spatial integration, some parts of the territory always remain weakly or not at all subsumed under the state power. This allows the people struggling against the dominant power to act relatively freely without much control or surveillance by the state power. Subsection E, counter-struggle by the state power to relinquish stray space. In contrast, the dominant power always attempts to have a firm grip over the entire expanse of its territory. It therefore strives hard to detect any insurgencies and attempts to relinquish stray space or any candidate for it. The power does so by developing more powerful means to achieve surveillance and control effectively the potential area for stray space. The dominant power thus introduces surveillance systems like the ubiquitous sensorium of the god that Isaac Newton assumed for absolute space or perception architecture. That is, a panopticon has centrality, the transparency of the cell, and the invisibility of the inspector, which work to intensify the effects of supervision by giving the inspector an apparent omnipresence. This is Robert Sack. For example, it sets up a security camera at every corner of the city street, asks those entering wilderness areas to obtain permits or to register beforehand with the authority, and deploys special operation forces on permanent standby to put down any attempt by the dissidents to transform a stray space into an alternative center for insurgents. Recently, advancing information and space technologies have contributed greatly to relinquish stray space further. Satellites have been launched to take high-resolution aerial photos from outer space to detect any suspicious activities in stray spaces. An information communication-equipped fare card for public transportation developed as Felica by Sony was first used in Hong Kong as the octopus card and later proliferated to other cities worldwide. For example, Suica by J.R. East in Japan, to continuously collect data on the action paths of any person. You can note that the end of the MetroCard in New York City works in this same way, because it forces you to use your cell phone as the means for going back and forth. So it changes the nature, the class nature of transportation as well, aside from the surveillance that you need to operate. You're billed on your phone. The phone, you need to sort of tap on the entryway in order to get to your subway, whatever. The data is stored, back to the text, the data is stored in the database of the IC Fare Card Company and are ready to be deployed by the authorities who wish to keep track of anyone's spatial actions. The dominant power has thereby equipped itself with an enhanced capacity to check and obliterate possibilities for a stray space, among other things, right? The iron frame of space thus becomes ever more tightly controlled and structured, while the people become more powerless in creating these alternative territories in secrecy. Subsection F, stray space for capitalist power. Intriguingly, stray space is also deployed by financial capital, which holds ultimate power under a neoliberalist regime. Financial capital can escape formal financial regulation exercised by the state power at the established financial core by transferring capital outside the regulatory reach of national jurisdiction or tax havens to enjoy lax or little taxation and control over financial operations. These tax havens are typically hidden in the periphery of global capitalism in terms of geography, off the beaten track of major financial nodes, and yet they often remain under the sovereignty of the financially powerful core countries. There's all these people congregating at St. Bart's this weekend. I mean, an incredible number. Anyway, a typical example is the Cayman Islands in the Caribbean, which is now a self-governing British overseas territory. The strength of the City of London as the real global financial center rests partly on the existence of financial consultants who are knowledgeable enough to advise their clients to take advantages of the loopholes in financial regulation present there. The formal part of the financial economy repeatedly claims, at least for appearance's sake, the need to put tax havens under more stringent control. Yet a crackdown on these financial stray spaces has been rarely conducted. The dominant global society has never labeled such stray spaces as, quote unquote, failed, placing them under surveillance or relinquishment. Tax havens are indeed an integral part of the neoliberalist financial economy, forming part and parcel of the dominant représentation de l'espace. Both types of stray space are produced purposefully in the periphery, yet only that emerging through the initiative of the subordinated is subject to a serious threat of extinction. The class nature of stray space is evident here. Subsection G, the people's right to mobility. There's also a need for spatial struggle to guarantee and enhance the human rights of mobility for those who do not possess or cannot drive a private car. An automobile-dominated society creates discrimination and real subsumption of relative space according to the income group and makes relative space more fragmented for the poor classes. The grassroots movement claiming the right to move, or droit du transport, droit au transport, addresses this issue. The right of transport has been advocated in Japan by the Association for the Research of Transportation Problems and Human Rights, the Kotsuken Gakkai. It issues a journal which has published research on difficulties in mobility among the grassroots people in conjunction with civilian initiatives. The Charter of Right to Transport, that is Associated for the Research of Transportation Problems and Human Rights, 1998, stipulates the principle of equality, security of safety, convenience, and culture, etc., in public transportation offered both by government and private industries. A movement demanding the right to mobility was also active in Watts, Los Angeles, the revolt of Black people who could not use cars and felt confined because of their lack of means of mobility instigated the opening of the public light rail connecting the heart of the Watts district to downtown Los Angeles. Well, it was that, but also the relation that you needed to have a line that would go all the way to Long Beach. So that's, whatever. With this movement, a tram line not containing the poor within a certain closed urban district, but enhancing mobility open to the general public was produced by the state power to achieve social integration. This is the problem of not having the subway go up into the central, up into the San Fernando Valley. But anyway, a similar situation can be found in the construction of the urban MTR in Hong Kong in the late 1970s by the British colonial government after a series of 2 riots waged by the ethnic Chinese people there. And he's mentioned that before. And the security contingencies built into that. Section 9.6, struggles around relational space. Remember, we looked at absolute space, relative space, and now relational space. Poor People's Optimum and Christoller's Central Place System. Poor People's Optimum, revisiting the first form of subsumption of relational space, it's essential for the surrounding demand space of a city, called a complementary region in the central place theory, to fulfill supply from the central place. The complementary region must have a sufficient spatial extent containing demand, that is a demand space, for the capitalists in charge of the supply of goods to the city to sustain itself economically. The extent of demand space must not be eroded through its overlapping with the complementary regions of other cities. In this sense, the urban hierarchy in capitalism must take a shape which guarantees a size of demand space sufficient to guarantee profit. This may be called the principle of the capitalist optimum in space. Here, it's intriguing to examine whether socialist Christoller built a system that satisfies the capitalist optimum or an alternative optimum. This section examines this point based on the model of territorial integration that Christoller himself built. The maximum range which an ordinary person, as a consumer, can travel to obtain a good or a service plays a crucial role in determining this point. Under capitalism, securing sufficient demand space, which generates sufficient profit, is the condition for the sustainable central place hierarchy. Now, for capitalists, any welfare considerations, like the existence of persons who are spatially out of reach of a certain type of commodity due to their remote location from the supply center, or the accessibility of people to the central places of various orders that supply goods, offering essential economic functions to them, is out of consideration. Capitalist space is always against the poor people's optimum, as postulated by Richard Peel. Planning for the provision of social services has been oriented towards either minimizing the cost of supply through centralizing facilities and achieving economies of scale, or towards maximizing access to services through decentralization. The starting point for our service supply model should be the preferences of the people who most need services. Our theories of the location of economic activity are constructed from the premise that location decision makers attempt to maximize profit, whereas the objective is to drag economic activity away from locations optimal in terms only of economic cost and push this activity as close as possible to the jobless population. So you see the conflict already. David Harvey states a similar point. The forces governing location from the producer's point of view are not necessarily beneficial when analyzed from the consumer's point of view. And there may exist conflict between the technological necessity for a few productive points and the physical necessity for a large number of spatially distributed consumption points. So this is that kind of contrast, or the contradiction of shopping centers, for example. It is not until Berry and Garrison's 1958 work that the central place hierarchy was reformulated to support the principle of the capitalist optimum. In Christoller's original formulation, the central place hierarchy is rather a normative concept built deductively out of his socialist norm that every person must be placed within the reach of the supply of all kinds of commodities. Gosh, how democratic is that? This concept in Christoller's own central place hierarchical model is best displayed in his explanation of the social process, whereby a lower order center is created. Quote, let us suppose that the upper limit of the range is the absolute spatial limit that a consumer can travel to obtain a good. Of central good number 21 is, under certain concrete conditions, 21 kilometers from central place B. There is now another central good number 20, which has a range of only 20 kilometers under the same conditions. Then obviously a ring 1 kilometer wide is at the edge of the region, which cannot be supplied with this central good by B alone. For supplying places within this ring, at least 3 other central places are necessary, which must lie equidistant from each other. So there's this whole nodal network thing that you can see, as he showed in the diagram in the earlier chapter of Christoller on central place theory, to see how this is all linked together. Now, capitalism doesn't quite work that way, unfortunately. Here, Christoller states in effect that the lower order center must always be established if the people living in a region which cannot be supplied with a certain type of commodity need to be supplied elsewhere. Christoller explicitly states that in developing the scheme, we simply spoke of the range, and the fixed value of the upper limit of the range was set there. This shows his social norm towards the poor people's optimum instead of profit maximization of capitalists. You can see, yeah, he's darn socialist. Because it is this idea that, there is some idea of equality or equity built into this. Now, Christoller claims that the consideration of the minimum size of investment required of capital to be competitive, that is the lower limit of the range in Christoller's terminology, or threshold in modern central place studies, does not alter the constellation of central places, but does alter the economic functions that exist at each order of center. He states, quote, with regard to the lower limit of the range of central goods, there is no new constellation in the net of central places, but only a change in the size of the types. So if in a region, the lower limit of the range for certain central goods is higher than normal, then the central places are generally more weakly developed because the offering of such goods frequently falls off. Close quote. Now, this suggests that the variety of commodities supplied from a particular order of center may be smaller in the hierarchical system based on the lower limit of the range, or the system created under the capitalist optimum, than that created based on the upper limit of the range, or the principle of the poor people's optimum. Subsection B, comparison of the central place systems based on two different social norms. The two optima, those of the poor people and of the capitalists, can be compared mathematically. Now, let's not go too crazy here, but as mentioned earlier in chapter 5, the fundamental differences between the two systems lies in whether the system is built upon the egalitarian conditions to satisfy everyone with the provisions of all kinds of goods, or upon the capitalist system where all the suppliers should be provided with normal profits. Reflecting this difference in norms, the poor people's optimum, that's Christoller's poor people's optimum, is built on the range, whereas the capitalist optimum, the Berry and Garrison, is on the threshold. So you have a center periphery, a localized center periphery model actually at work. To examine whether these differences make the function of the centers of the morphologically identical ranks different between the two systems, I first consider under the special assumption that range and threshold are equal. Now, they probably aren't, but he's being parsimonious here. For convenience, the range and threshold are to be commonly called here the reach of goods. Both Berry et al.'s A center and Christoller's L center here and after at A bracket L A bracket L bracket supply all the goods, including those of the sector with the greatest reach. For the capitalist system, the goods with the largest threshold, the area of a complementary region is identical with the area of a circle with a radius of that reach. There's kind of a geometric, we saw that in the explanation of central place. Putting the area of the complementary region of a function L, A bracket L bracket, center A squared, RA, or at this time the radius R Rn, Rn, or at this time the radius Rn of the reach of the good N is equal to Rn equals the square root of 1 over pi A, approximately 0.5642 A times A. On the other hand, the distance h from one vertex of the hexagonal complementary region to the center of the hexagon is hn square root of 2 over 3 times the square root of 3 times A, or alpha, is approximately 0.6204 A. That's 9.1, equation 9.1, and equation 9.2. Now, since Rn is shorter than Hn, there are already unsupplied gaps for this good at each vertex of the complementary region. You can see that just by the numbers. In the poor people's optimum, one lower B, that is P order center, needs to be set up here. B bracket P bracket order center needs to be set up here. The lower order center becomes necessary when a good has a reach slightly less than H over N over divided by R over N, which is approximately 1.0996 Rn. On the other hand, for the capitalist optimum, it is the hierarchical marginal good N minus I, which gives rise to a lower order center. Since the area of this lower order complementary region is 1/3 of an order higher, the radius of the reach of good R N minus 1, N minus I, is R N minus I over the square root of 1 over 3 divided by pi A, which is 0.3257. In short, all this arm waving, the length of the reach of the hierarchical marginal good, which gives rise to the B bracket P bracket center, is about equations 9.2 to 9.4, which is equal to 0 minus which is equal to 0.2946 shorter in the case of the capitalist system as compared to the poor people's system. It is shorter by about 52%, 52.5%. With regard to the G center in the poor people's system, as it was already clear from equations 5.1, you have to go all the way back to that, 5.3, when the radius of reach is 1 over square root of 3 times hn, that is when the good is 0.3582 the lower order center is to be set up. These relationships are extended and summarized in figure 9.1. Here, attention should be paid to the set of goods supplied from the center of C bracket G bracket. In the poor people's system, this point provides a group of goods with a reach less than or equal to 1.0996 times n minus I minus delta. However, in the capitalist system, some of these products are not supplied even from the B bracket P bracket center, which is one order above. The supply from the G bracket center starts only when the reach of the good is R n minus I. The goods with the largest reach supplied from this order differ from the systems for poor people and those for the capitalists. So there's a long way of saying, these differences are created over time, and you can see how they change when if you plop a big box store like a Walmart somewhere, you can see how this gets disrupted in some ways, or the difference between village structures and shopping centers, for example. The goods with the largest reach supplied from the poor people's system and the capitalist system are therefore greatly different. From equations 9.2 and 9.4 above, the radius of the largest reach of the goods supplied at the center in the poor people's system is h over n r n minus I is approximately 1.9046 times more than that of the capitalist system. So when the goods n minus j at center C bracket G bracket are supplied by the capitalist system, the goods with the larger reach are supplied even from the D bracket B center one order below in the poor people's system. Thus, when the range and the threshold are the same in size, the sets of goods supplied at the centers of each order differ under the poor people's system and are far more affluent than that of the capitalist system. In the former system, people can enjoy a more affluent supply of goods. So we see differentiation over space. And I think if you want to look at this at figure 9.1, which is the comparison of the reach of the goods under the capitalist and poor people's optima, the two different optima, you can see that the radii are different from, the various centers, and you can see that it is greater or whatever, bigger for poor people's optimum as opposed to capitalist optimum. And these are all just simply radii. It's just geometric. It's not anything, this is, it has a heuristic function here. In fact, it'd be interesting to see this actually applied in actual territory. Anyway, of course, back to the text, the assumption that the range and threshold are equal can only be established by chance in reality. See? And there are various potential relations between the two. Next, then, more general relationships between the range and threshold to be examined. In capitalist society, the acquisition of average profit in the long run is an absolute requirement. Yes. Therefore, for the establishment of the system under the poor people's optimum to be possible in a capitalist economy, it is necessary to satisfy the condition that the minimum demand space required for the sale of the smallest, in figure 5.2, good K, just before giving rise to the big capital K center, which shall be called here hierarchy-specific lowest goods category of goods that the capitalist system does not supply or is not eroded by each other in the poor people's system. To satisfy this condition, The area of the complementary region of the central system established on the poor people's optimum must satisfy the size of the demand space required for capitalist profit making. This is all a lot of arm waving to give you a kind of marginal solution. Anyway, now considering the radius of the range of the hierarchy specific lowest good in a central place at R sub R, the area of the complementary region H shall then be H R 3 over square root of 3 over 2 times R squared, big R squared, sub R. Suppose that the minimum required demand space H takes the form of a circle, which is what we've been dealing with, then the maximum radius of threshold Ri max that can be taken from the hierarchy specific lowest good is pi times Ri max equals 3 times the square root of 3 over 2 times big R squared, big R, small r squared. Oh, God. Therefore, R maximum or R max equals the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 over 2 divided by pi times R, which is equal to 0.9094 R, which is equation 9.7. In other words, only when the threshold has a radius of about 0.9094 times or less than the range, a necessary condition for the establishment of the central place system based on the poor people's optimum shall be established. On the other hand, in the poor people's system based on the range, if the threshold of the hierarchy specific good is much smaller than the range of that of threshold is equal to or exceeds the interstitial area not included in the threshold surrounded by the 3 central places that supply a good, then another lower order center that supplies the same good emerges at the center of the interstitial area. In this case, the ratio between the range and threshold is determined by the length of the radius R of the lower limit relative to R when the area of the portion indicated by the downward diagonal lines S1 and that of the portion indicated by the upward diagonal lines S2 are identical in 5.4. Now, this is the problem of he didn't include all this in the he should have put 5.4 in as a box in here or something, but anyway. The area of the equilateral triangle A1, A2, A3, which includes the part not covered with a threshold, is the point O, forms the center of gravity of the triangle. So without yakking about this, we have equation 9.9, equation 9.10, which is, just a simplification. And solving this for R, we have this little thing, which is R equals 1 equal equation 911, then R equals 0.5250. That is, the system based on the poor people's optimum would not be feasible in capitalist society unless the radius of threshold exceeds 0.5250 times of range, because a new center would emerge from the interstitial area. Now, you may, find this tedious or whatever, but try to imagine, let's say you have a specialty food store, like one that has South Asian foods or something. You could say that, how would you optimize the position of it so that it could take advantage of capitalist, higher income kind of region, as well as serving the South Asian community or whatever. Now, the problem, of course, is that in America, people are much more spread out and dispersed, and this probably doesn't work real well. But you could see that these marginal areas, I think, come from this model. From the above analysis, the radius R I of threshold has to stay in relation to R, or the radius of range of hierarchy-specific lowest goods. Now, therefore, you have this little equality, and then examine the same relation of goods with the range is slightly smaller than blah, 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 blah. This good has the maximum range of the goods among those not supplied in the center in the order below. Following the previous designation, it could be called the hierarchy-specific highest good. Here again, the maximum possible extent of threshold does not erode into each other is the area of the complementary region of an order below that of central place. This can be expressed in terms of R sub R. And therefore, all that, wandering around, and therefore, at the end, we get, 914. And so, ultimately, the range is smaller. It's a lower order. And without going through all the math here, based on the above considerations in the system for the poor people, the hierarchy-specific highest goods R must be within this new range. And you can see that relative to change and the inequality here from the above, examining conditions for establishing the system based on the poor people's optimum in capitalist society for both the highest and lowest hierarchy-specific goods supplied in the central places of an order, but not supplied in the lower order central areas. Equations 912 and 917 are obtained. Putting them together, both equations overlap at only one point, where R1 slightly exceeds R2 by about 0.5250 times. The central place system for the poor people is established under capitalism only in the very exceptional case where the threshold and range maintain this relation. In fact, in this value, a completely identical central system is formed in both systems. So, of course, in reality, it's rare that such conditions are met, as I just mentioned, as long as the purpose of capital is to obtain profits and secure effective demand in space. It is unlikely that a system based on Christoller's own socialism-inspired model will be established under laissez-faire capitalism unless any social struggle for the poor people's optimum is waged. So you can see this explains, with all due respect, why there are food deserts. Now, I know this is a long way to go, but it does sort of explain in some instances why there are food deserts appear, and for a variety of reasons, but some of it has to do with these range requirements. So I'm sorry to diverted your attention there. 9.7, struggles around spatial scale, porosity, and scale jumping. The porosity of boundaries and spatial fix. As discussed in section 5 of chapter 3, the porosity of boundaries creates contiguity in absolute space at higher scales. This contiguity gives rise to the action space at a higher scale, while at lower scales, bounded territories exist for the purpose of control. Thus, a multi-layered system of spatial configuration consisting of mosaics of overlapping territories of multiple scales emerges. Each spatial position is thus assigned to more than one territory of various scale, which overlap in a vertical hierarchy. This is that, millefeuille that I was talking about before, right? The Napoleon, the pastry. Even if the power which dominates the territory at a certain spatial scale sets up a boundary, it is superimposed with a contiguous layer of other scales, undermining the boundary. Therefore, if an entity or group can command a higher order territory, it acquires the contiguity of absolute space and the concomitant new spatial instance at a different scale. Thus, this uncontrolled movement across boundaries gives the people at each scale the opportunity to fulfill diverse interests of their own. Thus, the relationship between spatial scales begins to take on some anarchy, depending on the strength of the power of the entity or group overriding the boundary. I think you could describe this as the difference between, there's a village that happens to be near the shopping center. And the advantage is, of course, that either it's walking distance or you can take the bus from the village to the shopping center, and thereby, it equals out a little bit. For example, speculative financial capital can use various means to override the boundary of macroeconomic territories already experiencing a glut in capital and gain new opportunities for profit by investing in green field areas where capital is scarce and the profit rate is high. Now, this action to overcome the boundedness set in absolute space for self-interest and avoid the problem of capital overproduction to postpone the crisis is called spatial fix. Let me repeat that. This action to overcome the boundedness set in absolute space for self-interest and avoid the problem of capitalist overproduction to postpone crises is called a spatial fix. So whether that gives you more explanatory power is a whole different question, but it does describe the kind of lags that we get, I think, that space, because of this annihilation activity, creates lags. It just comes. It's mathematical in that sense. The production of lower domains for control, those dominating the territory with political or economic power in a scale may, on the other hand, create controlled layers of the collective absolute spaces at lower scale within it to dominate and rule more effectively the people and economy under its jurisdiction. The division of business territories as subordinate administrative units is a case in point. Although the lower order territories are bound and separated from each other, the boundaries are always open to the higher order scale controlled by the headquarters. The CEO at the headquarters draws the boundaries so that the lower order administration embodies the will of the corporate power covering the entire territory for their business. The state power also deploys the borders as a barrier to manipulate the spatial movement of the people under control. It can manipulate the porosity of the boundary of the lower scale to limit the extent of action space of the people under its rule. This is kind of how the PRC works with the Uyghurs, and kind of how they, I mean, it's much more complicated than that, but how it co-opted Tibet, for example. The power that dominates the higher order territory often uses the maneuver of divide and rule to make the subservient people spatially fragmented so that those the ruled would not come together to set themselves against the power. There's something wrong there. For example, the Bengal region, which most strongly advocated independence from the UK, was divided into two parts, right? Independent India and East Pakistan, when British India became independent. Thus, its overwhelming political power was prevented from influencing the politics of independent India. In the feudal Edo period of Japan, Sakisho, that is, checkpoints, were established in various places, including Hakone, and daimyo, that is, feudal lords, were able to pass freely, but the spatial movement of people was strictly controlled here so that people would not stand up to the Edo military government in unity nationwide. Subsection C, the struggle in the multiscalar spatial configuration. In a class or a multi-ethnic society, the outcome of real subsumption of space is riven with social struggles. The dominant subordinate relationship arises along with the expansion of frontiers. Now, whether this multiscalar spatial relationship emerges or not depends on the relative strength of power between these groups or among these groups, which crush against one another. The multiscalar configuration of space is the outcome of this power struggle among these groups for domination or autonomy. When the dominant group wins, the spatial configurations thus produced are composed of multiple layers or scales, each of which is class or ethnicity specific. In this interscalar struggle, the subordinated people on a scale may attempt to attack by deploying action space, for example, a scale produced by those with authoritative power to constrain them. In return, the dominant power fights back by institutionalizing boundaries, keeping surveillance over them, and attempting to retake control of the spatial configurations to forestall the struggle. The ultimate solution to those in domination may be that the power in one scale dominates another in the lower scale. At any rate, The interrelationship between the scales can be contradictory and struggle prone, just as the dominant / subordinate classes or ethnic relations are also always struggle prone. I think if you were going to describe a space like that, it could be Syria, maybe, is kind of like that, in terms of, the relative complexity of it and all of the other reasons for why it was so screwed up. As the struggle of the people and the concept of local self-government advance in general, these lower order territories can increasingly come to be the spatial base for local autonomy, steered by the political entities and local scale, and eventually lead to the breakup of the higher order scale of state power as manifested in the prospective independence of Catalonia or even Scotland. That's an interesting point to actually try to mobilize. I assume there's a literature for this. At this time, the social struggle is, in sense, transformed into that of the interscalar. Now, to forestall this struggle, the dominant power reinforces the boundary, keeps surveillance over the subordinate territories, and thereby attempts to maintain domination and control in the multiscalar spatial configuration. Those in domination thereby aim to integrate the multiscalar set of territories in a way that best supports their domination with territorial integration or vertical coordination of multiple scales in an attempt to contain the challenge of subversion from the subordinated period. Territorial integration is thus the way in which those in domination substantiate their power, piercing the overlapping scales. Now, you could argue that the Spanish train system sort of does this. That is, in terms of that they have all these local things, narrow gauge, trains and all kinds of freight and other stuff. But you also have, class divisions and the high speed rail, which is quite radical in the sense of, the speed at which, if you're of a certain class, I suppose, get from, whatever it is, Madrid to Barcelona or whatever. Those in domination may not always be harsh and oppressive, and instead may attempt to co-opt the subordinated class or social group in the lower scale. The outcome may be the one and the same scale being shared by different classes or ethnic groups, as in the case of the built environment. This is one of the issues that I assume that he's going to apply to Hong Kong. D, scale jumping, command of the higher order scale for winning the struggle. According to Pyle, different power relations may produce different power relations may produce different power relations. Yeah, and further, the resistance may well operate between spaces authorized by authority. The struggle against the power that managed to set a battlefront at the global scale has different authority. Thus, it may have stronger leverage for winning as compared to those confined in the local scale. As discussed in the previous section, the subordinated individuals or groups in space are in no way obliged to be confined within this, assumed range of their action space. To empower themselves, they may opt to expand their spatial range of action beyond the spatial limit of the power that oppresses them. On the other hand, you want to get groceries. They then attempt to reach a higher order spatial scale. This frees them from the oppressive power dominating in the territory at the lower scale and makes them able to access an emancipatory, often more empowering spatial range for struggle. Now, this spatial strategy is called scale jumping. Scale jumping has the effect of switching the spatial scale of action to a higher one so that people are empowered more effectively and have a better chance of realizing their political or social rights. Scale jumping is especially effective with respect to the space of a nation, since the space of state power is the space of the ruling class's hegemony over its people and over the nationhood that it has arrogated. Ms. Lefebvre, once a subject manages to escape this hegemony of state power, which makes decisions in such a way to ensure that the interest of certain minorities, of certain classes or fraction of classes are imposed on society, the state can no longer impose its power on anyone in the society. And I suppose you could argue this for, Catalonia, the Basques versus, Spanish and all the other, overlapping divisions, etc. Exacerbated, of course, by history, going back to, the Civil War, the Spanish Civil War. Scale jumping is a good manifestation of the dialectics between Wirkungsraum and action space. Contrary to the social spatial processes discussed in the previous sections, the production of the espace de representation is not required here. The production of the space of representation is not required here. The people somehow manage to expand their spatial ranges and jump out of the existing scale at lower orders into a higher spatial scale to increase their influence and make their voices heard to a wider global audience. And the example here, as evidenced in the Zapatista movement, the deployment of cyberspace can play a crucial role. Movements at the provincial scale in the rural state of Chiapas in Mexico exerted global influence and gained support from distant places through the internet, Commander Gonzalo or whatever, the action space of which was essentially global. The scale jumping entails emancipation because it involves the spatial expansion of the struggle beyond the institutionalized boundary of the territory where the state authority exercises power to oppress the subordinated people. A state power cannot exercise it beyond its institutionalized boundary, while the subordinated can command a wider action space at a higher spatial scale where their supporters exist for their struggle. I suppose you could argue this also, although probably not as well, relative to history, for the rebels in Peru, maybe. I don't know. Another example is of local people who suffer from environmental pollution caused by a multinational corporation-owned plant, environmental racism. They remain powerless as long as they struggle against the multinational only at the scale of their own political jurisdiction. Even if they succeed in their struggle for stricter environmental regulations, the multinational corporation may simply resort to a spatial fix of moving its plant elsewhere to evade the stricter restrictions. In this case, those people need to acquire a spatial scale that matches with the action space of the multinational corporation. They need to jump the scale, sometimes skipping the national scale to appeal. For example, to an alternative non-governmental organization with global reach, such as Greenpeace, and persuade it to mobilize its power against the global authority of the multinational corporation. When the multinational corporation can no longer resort to the spatial fix, that is, switching territories on the same spatial scale to evade the struggle of the local people, this is the, freedom cities are one example of that. This is a kind of spatial fix in that sense. The struggle of citizens against against the human rights infringements by the child the spatial fix, that is, switching territories on the same spatial scale to evade the struggle of the local people. The local people will achieve victory. The struggle of citizens against the human rights infringements by the Child Guidance Center of the Japanese government, discussed in the following section of this chapter, is another case in point. After all, creation or production of a planet-wide space as the social foundation of a transformed everyday life opens myriad possibilities. There is, nevertheless, an important condition for successful scale jumping. The higher order scale must be more emancipatory and devoid of the oppressive authority that exists at the lower scale. Not always true, of course, that a higher order scale is more emancipatory than the lower. This is typically demonstrated in the case of present-day Hong Kong. It does not make sense, for example, for the democracy-seeking Hong Kongers to jump from the local to the national scale under the Beijing authority. Well, more complicated than that. In some cases, local and regional autonomy could be used. Whatever party stands to benefit from shifting the local and state decision-making to the particular scale that favors its own interests. Well, it's more than that. I mean, I would assert that there are complications relative even past the assimilation back into the PRC. They do have a relative autonomy, and I think in the Hong Kong governmental structure, which often gets in the way. In sum, those who command a spatial scale that has a more favorable emancipatory social ambience have a higher prospect of winning the struggle. 9.8, we're almost to the end. The emancipation from authoritative space, a case of struggles against the human rights infringements by the child guidance centers in Japan. Now, this final section demonstrates a case of socio-spatial struggle that I have directly engaged in to demonstrate the combined class-specific processes of space subsumption for absolute and relative space, as well as the properties of relational space and the concomitant strategies of spatial struggle. Section A, Introduction, the body under social space of prohibition. Now, Lefebvre states, the fleshly, that is the spatiotemporal body, is already in revolt. Yeah, I suppose if you fart. The human body has an inherent property of space, which is an object of appropriation and therefore a source of the revolt. Since the production of a territory by those in power always entails a spatial area of domination, social space is the locus of prohibition. Anything against the will of the state power appropriating body of the people shall thus be extinguished. The space of pretended welfare, becomes prone to the sudden eruptions of violence of the state power. Yet the mosaic of social space of territory is a function of the dialectical opposite, a subversion which breaks the tablets of the law. It's interesting to quote Nietzsche. I guess Lefebvre is quoting Nietzsche. A body strives to find its emancipation and empowerment through shifting the spatial scale by transferring to outside of the state power that dominates the social space. Subsection B, oppression of bodies through the space produced by the state power. A good example is found in the struggle against the child guidance centers, CGCs, hereafter in Japan. The system is quite similar to the removal of Aboriginal children to white families or orphanages run by whites under the white Australia policies. They're not dissimilar to the United States in that same way. This policy, though, lasted until the early 1970s, although on the books, I think the US stuff lasted almost that long. After which Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister of Australia, officially apologized in 2008. A similar policy called the 60s Scoop was implemented in Canada until the 1960s, by which Indigenous children, we've talked about this before in our little group here, by which Indigenous children were removed from their biological families under the pretext of their well-being and adopted by white families. The latter victims are now demanding an apology and compensation, for sure. This is not a class struggle in the classical sense, no, but it is indeed a struggle along disputed frontiers crossing all sectors of society, extra-political as well as political. Currently, a system most similar to the CGC in Japan is Barnevernet in Norway. The operation of a Barnevernet, whatever, has been severely criticized as infringing human rights globally, and the Japanese CGC has generated almost exactly the same sorts of problems. In neoliberalist Japan, under the welfare guise of child guidance, with the claim of being the last bastion for suffering children, children are removed and alienated from their families under venial or false abuse charges by the Child Guidance Center and treated as a commodity. This happens in Texas. The children are then transferred to fill the beds of former orphanages left empty after the World War II orphans had come of age. Jesus, this is like not Lebensraum, the other, the Nazi eugenics program. Anyway, these former orphanages are run by private corporations for profit with vested interests. Otherwise, these children are sold to infertile families. Lebensborn, that's it. Otherwise, these children are sold to infertile families either within Japan or overseas under the government's special adoption scheme for $2 million. It is de facto child trafficking. Yes, you can argue that. In fact, it's no different, with all due respect, to the things that are taken advantage of relative to Bulgaria and Romania, I think, in terms of anyway. Article 14 of the UN Guidelines for the Alternative Care of Children, 2009, provides removal of child from the care of the family should be seen as a measure of last resort and should, whenever possible, be temporary and for the shortest possible duration. Emphasis mine. In the Japanese child guidance system, however, this is seldom respected and implemented. Colluding with the private corporations running former orphanages or alternative care facility, the policy to remove children from their families has been emphatically promoted by Japan's Ministry of Labor, Health, and Welfare, which functions as if it is a harbinger of renewed authoritarianism in everyday governance. Japanese people tend not to get involved with radical politics, but they prefer to see things. Wilkinson and Pickett pointed out, drawing on a UN survey, that Japanese people had a fairly high level of public trust, as manifested in the rarity of violent uprisings, even in acute political situations. In spite of this social ambience, the families victimized by the CGC operations were very militantly mobilized, as manifested, for example, in 2 cases reported in the media of family members whose children had been kidnapped by the CGCs, throwing Molotov cocktails to the CGC yards and bringing many court cases against the authority. Oh, there we go. A considerable number of CGC victims in Japan are now more positively confront the state authority, aware that the state can never play a constructive or supportive role in improving the daily life or the future prospect of anyone, and will put people and families under surveillance, and if necessary, criminalize and incarcerate all those who do not broadly accede to their dictates. You see, there's underlying, imperial, the fascism of, well, anyway, the anger of the Japanese family is quite rational and persuasive, because the CGC scheme in Japan infringes the sound and peaceful lives of the biological families, which are duly protected by the international human rights laws and supposedly nurtured by the traditional Japanese culture value that has lasted for centuries. Intriguingly, this CGC system of authority, as well as the struggles of the people against the system, have much to do with Lefebvre's claim that, quote, space is becoming the principal stake of goal-directed actions and struggles. First, the relational space produced by the Japanese state power in removing the children from their families is quite similar to that of a totalitarian state, such as Nazi Germany or the Stalinist Soviet Union. Totalitarian states are unique in how they subsume space to produce a unique spatial configuration with 2 prominent elements. The first element is a network of snitches controlled by the central authority, making the entire territory a ubiquitous sensorium of the state power, encouraging the report of abuse from the citizens through hotline number 189. The totalitarian system has its unique political space where snitching and detention are integrated, operated by the secret police with supreme administrative power incomparable to the regular judicial police, which act on an arrest warrant by a court. Very similar things happening in the US. In the second element, Nazi Germany had concentration camps such as Auschwitz, and the Soviet Union under Stalin had gulags in Siberia. In these facilities, persons captured by the secret police were detained in confined and isolated space in harsh environment under close surveillance for an extended period. Yes, gulags. The administrative authority unconditionally detained the body arbitrarily without an a priori third-party authorization. It's kind of what they're doing to, Ukrainian kids and that kind of, well, anyway. Political police detain people in many cases through snitching. No one knows when anyone around them will betray them and report them to the secret police. The spatial representation of this totalitarian system resembles a panopticon, an architecture of surveillance and control, which makes the whole national space under surveillance of the state power just like a prison. The panopticon, devised by Jeremy Bentham, makes the power with constraints and violence omnipresent. It has an efficient and effective surveillance capability not only over the convicts, but everyone, turning the national space into a space of permanent, unfailing, ubiquitous surveillance for collecting all sorts of information. The Leipzig office of the former East German Stasi, which has been open to the public as a museum since the collapse of East Germany, the GDR, exhibits a report submitted by a pupil to a teacher who was a henchman to the SED regime, the Socialist Party regime. The report confessed the pupil's dissatisfaction with life in East Germany. The teacher informed the Stasi about the pupil and the pupil's parents with a copy of the report. The pupil and the parents were thus unknowingly placed under monitoring by the Stasi. And as soon as the information would have added up to the threshold arbitrarily set by the authority, the family would be subject to interrogation or detainment on charges of treason. The CGC in Japan adopted a quite similar system called the risk assessment of families. Since the enactment of the child abuse prohibition law in 2000, the children are arbitrarily detained by the CGC, which has the authority of state power under Article 33 of the Child Welfare Act of Japan. That is, Nazi Germany, the Stalinist Soviet Union, East Germany, and the CGCs in Japan all had a common feature in that they produced the relational space consisting of the national scale with secret police at the center, which exerts tyrannical control over people across the nation through a political space made ubiquitous, like pristine, absolute space, together with the strictly bound space of confined and isolated concentration camps. This is the spread of 8 new private detention centers that is coming up. This configuration of space is indeed the spatial manifestation of suppression and appropriation. It is homologous to the spatial organization of the child guidance system in Japan for several reasons. First, the state imposed a legal requirement to notify it of abuse cases using the hotline number 189, even if there's no hard evidence, with secrecy guaranteed. I had mentioned this before. I mean, you have this in Missouri has a some of this, and Texas has one like this as well. Or those bounties, you put out, your neighbor is getting an abortion, you should report them or whatever. The CGC accumulates the information thus collected in a single file under the heading of an individual child and gives points to the findings which may or may not be related to child abuse. Then, when the points add up to the threshold set arbitrarily and secretly, the child is removed from its family at the discretion of the director of the CGC, not through the regular judicial action with a warrant from the court. See, this is, how ICE is operating, right? Second, innocent children are then held for an extended period in the detention quarter of the CGC without ever being allowed to receive compulsory education as stipulated in the Constitution. This is that same problem with, Indian schools. If children detained in the quarter of the CGC resist the warden, they will be disciplined by being confined to a small and detached space, which is a place of disciplinary monotony. Oh my God. And forced to perform punitive tasks ordered by the warden. This is children, right? They would then be transferred to an alternative care facility, ACF hereafter, where they're kept under strict surveillance and detention, which lasts for 2 years, yet is repeatedly renewed until they come of age. The visitation of family members to their own child is severely restricted or often totally denied by the CGC director. The child thus detained is treated as an artificial orphan by the ACF, the alternative care facility, and used as an instrument by the private corporation running the ACF to obtain the government allowances to run its welfare business, privatized, right? Welfare. Anyway, in short, The CGC system in Japan is supported by the same system of relational space as Nazi Germany and the Stalinist Soviet Union, with the only difference being that the latter is centered on the secret state police and the former is under the guise of welfare. Yet state power allows in both cases for the confiscation and subsequent detainment of the human body, that is a child's human body, without due court warrant. Once this system is extended to adults, the prison industrial complex, right? Extended to adults, it can immediately be transformed to use as a system of suppression by a totalitarian state. Gee, what's going on now? The United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child thus recommended the Japanese government to thoroughly amend its child welfare laws, but the Japanese government has not completely complied with it to date. Well, there you go. Subsection C, the spatial struggle of a family seeking asylum in the Netherlands. In the summer of 2007, the daughter of a family in Nagasaki was removed from her mother by the Nagasaki CGC, alleging that the mother abused the daughter. Article 33 of Child Welfare Act, CWA of Japan, states that bodies composing a biological family can be arbitrarily broken apart by the CGC in execution of the state power. There are other departments of children and family services do this in the United States. This domestic law is clearly against Article 9 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and UN committees under the umbrella of the High Commission for Human Rights, that same thing that operates in Gaza. I have repeatedly asked Japan to amend it. In the global spatial scale, therefore, Japan thus remains a social space of prohibition, where a family cannot nurture its bonds peacefully and stably. The space in Japan is dominated by power. It proceeds to repress in the name of power that intervenes in families. The Nagasaki CGC planned to consolidate the separation of the family through the submission of an Article 28 plea, which put the body of the daughter into an alternative care facility. Although it's normally a breeze for the CGC to have the family court approve the plea, the first instance of the Nagasaki family court turned it down. Then the CGC, in secrecy, transferred her away from the CGC detention quarters. Gee, that sounds familiar. With the daughter's whereabouts concealed. The CGC then appealed the case to the Fukuoka High Court, which approved the plea on the evidence fabricated by the CGC. The intimate bodily relation of the family was thus destroyed by state authority. The mother then sought support from a human rights organization to subvert the space of the state power by creating her own counter space that would shift the power in space. On 24 October 2008, during the organization's activities to find the daughter, the grandfather spotted her. Grandfather, why are you here? Did you come to pick me up? That's right. Let's go home together. Your mother is right there. The daughter decided to leave the ACF, the space of confinement, where the authorities reified and made visible. She ran away with all her might. At that time, a supporter said she ran for her life to see her mother, and I could see, indeed, that the CGC had made an irrational separation. The daughter rejoiced at meeting her mother for the first time in about a year. The family recovered their bodily relation that had been destroyed through the undue infliction of the state power. Suddenly, the ACF director showed up and started to rip the daughter violently away from her mother. The mother exclaimed desperately, "Stop it!" The daughter's body began to distort under the masculine power of the ACF director. The daughter exclaimed, "It's hurting me. Don't do it." The grandfather and their supporters shouted at the director, the child is hurting. What are you doing?" The ACF director pretended he did not hear. 3 supporters then grabbed his arm, stopped his assault on the daughter, who was freed from his grip for a moment, and immediately jumped into a car through the door that her mother had opened. God. The human rights organization members and the grandfather were taken to a police station. A detective told one of the members that the ACF director had brought criminal charges against them. They were detained in the police station and interrogation began. A detective asked, They were fleeing to a foreign country, weren't they? Which airport did they go to? Supporters knew that transgressing the state boundary towards emancipation from the state power of Japan was the most crucial moment to restore the bond of mother and daughter. They therefore lied to save the family. Well, we've heard that they will take a direct flight from Kansai Airport in Osaka to Europe. While the police were meddling with the long passenger lists there, the family safely left Japan through the passport control gate at Fukuoka International Airport in Kyushu for Seoul, South Korea, and then for the Netherlands. In Seoul, the mother rang up ahead of the organization who had supported their exodus from the space of prohibition. Yes, the family did manage to create their own counter-action space. The family arrived at Schiphol, or Schiphol, I can't remember how to pronounce it, in Amsterdam on 26 October 2008. Nagasaki police put them on the international wanted list through Interpol, prompting the Dutch authorities to place the daughter in custody upon arrival. Yet, since there was no extradition treaty between the Netherlands and Japan, the mother was not sent back home. Acting across the global mosaic of fragmented collective spaces, the family now subverted the state power of Japan and turned the mosaic into the action space of emancipation to save their bodies in the intimate family relation. After several proceedings, the Dutch court ruled on 29 December 2008 to allow the family to settle in the Netherlands together in exile. However, the members of the human rights organization who remained in Japan were accused of, quote, kidnapping the daughter and were charged with criminal offenses and sentenced to imprisonment. Lefebvre aptly comments the, quote, power, which is to say violence, divides, then keeps what it has divided in a state of separation. Inversely, it reunites, yet keeps what it has divided in a state of confusions, where we are now in the US. On 23 April 2018, when the daughter reached the age of 19, she returned to Japan to clear her name after having hidden herself in the Netherlands for about 10 years before the safety of her body from the arbitrary detention of the Japanese CGC was assured. She issued a statement claiming, "What the CGC did to me was a crime. Please give me back my life and time with my family in Japan." It suggests that her body has been unable to build an autogenous bond with the social space of the Netherlands, which remains the place of displacement to her. This is very similar to how dreamers are treated. You know, you're being, thrown out of the country to a country that you've never known. The mother, nevertheless, is still unable to return to Japan, as she's still considered a criminal in Japanese prohibitive social space. After all, every state is born of violence, and state power endures only by virtue of violence directed toward a space. That's currently what we're doing now. Subsection D, another transgression. The CGC victims in Japan appealing their infringed human rights to the UN committees. To attain the scale jumping in solving the human rights infringements perpetuated by the CGC, the Japanese families whose children had been abducted by the CGC filed alternative reports directly with the UNCRC in Geneva in 2017. But since Japan has not ratified the third optional protocol to the convention, individual reporting system, CGC victim families cannot bring their individual cases directly to the UNCRC even today. A human rights group called the Concerned Japanese Citizens for the Rights of the Child to Eradicate Child Guidance Center Sufferings invited the CGC victims across the nation to publish their sufferings in an alternative report on their human rights infringed by the CGC. The JCREC put them together, added theoretical and historical explanations, submitted to the UNCRC in November 2017 and December 2018. This UNCRC duly considered the reports and issued its concluding observations in March 2019. The UNCRC has paid due attention to the human rights infringements by the CGC since the late 2000s. This move constitutes an action for scale jumping. The human rights problems in association with the CGC was first known outside Japan when the Japan branch of the Defense for Children International invited Lothar Kropman, a German sociologist, and then the head of the UNCRC, to investigate Japan's compliance with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Through interaction with people, he was astonished that the CGC issue was something that could possibly occur in a country which claims itself to be advanced in terms of human rights. Indeed, this astonishment culminated in the concerns and recommendations of the third concluding observations of the UNCRC on Japan, issued in June 2010. Children who do not meet the behavioral expectations of school are transferred to child guidance centers, and to commission an independent investigation of the child guidance system and its working methods. Yes. The Japanese government totally ignored these recommendations. The UNCRC has thus become more engaged in tackling, I suppose, the CGC issue of Japan. Prior to the review session held in January 2019, members of the Task Force on Japan of the UNCRC offered an opportunity for an informal meeting with representatives of the JCREC at the Palais Wilson. In the sessions held in 2018 and 2019, Olga Kazova, the vice chair of the UNCRC from Russia, raised intense questions about the issue. Having spent her childhood in the Soviet era and later obtained an LLM degree from Cornell, she must have had a sense of deja vu from the totalitarian Stalinist regime and Japan's current CGC policy. So in March 2019, UNCRC issued the fourth and fifth combined final observations, which devoted 2 entire paragraphs, 28 and 29, out of 54, to the CGC issues. One significant achievement among them was that the UNCRC expressed its allegation of a strong financial incentive for the child guidance centers to receive more children. That is, the welfare guise of the CGC was torn off, and the neoliberal monetary, the neoliberalist monetary incentives exposed. The Anglo-American generic neoliberalism proclaimed that it would shrink government to the point where it could be drowned in a bathtub. That's David Harvey quoting what's his name. Welfare provisions were to be either scrapped or privatized. However, in Japan, government ministries, especially the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, sought to retain their vested interests and even enhance them via taxpayers' money under the guise of welfare. Even in reality, it is contrary to it. Currently, about 2/3 of a child guidance center's annual budget comprises expense items supposedly catering to temporary custody, which is calculated as follows: custody allowance multiplied by the expected number of children to be detained. Every child guidance center is compelled to cater to the expected number of children as stipulated in the annual budget. Otherwise, the budget in the following fiscal year will be reduced. Quota system. Therefore, the expected number of children to be detained is called the abduction quota by the families and victimized by the CGC. That's what we should probably call what's going on now. Most ACFs originated as orphanages immediately after World War II. Once the Japanese government began subsidizing the cost of caring for the children in custody in 1948, it turned to a vested interest to make money out of children. As orphans came of age and the beds became empty, ACF managers began demanding the government send more children into their care. The government ultimately set up a system in the late 1990s to streamline the process of the CGC, transferring the children moved from their families to the ACFs. The natural consequence was to make the government as large and quaint as a monster, using children as pieces of neoliberalist money-making. Thus, the Japanese people were being deprived of both money via the ever heavier tax burden and their beloved children. the variant of neoliberalism may be called neoliberalism in the Oriental way. Well, I don't know if that's anyway. The UNCRC committee members seemingly understood this Japanese welfare system's dispossessive and predatory nature to the point of daylight robbery of children from their families, particularly of the poor and the vulnerable, the unsophisticated, and the legally unprotected. These UNCRC recommendations created a significant foothold for the victim families to dismantle the human rights infringing CGC system in Japan. The scale jumping strategy of the CGC victims of Japan has therefore thereby met with splendid success internationally. I got to the end. This is the end. But you can see how he applied all of the different ideas that he was sort of working through, and he's obviously worked through it because he's an activist. And you could see that, there is spatial displacement, there's monetization, there's commodifying of children, and the United States is no different. Well, with all due respect, it's kind of the same damn things are happening, and we're just not quite there yet. But you can see how certain elements of the apparatus can operate, and I don't want to deal with it. Let's get ICE in here to do whatever it's going to do, and that's kind of where we are with the our own Gestapo. And social media will make everyone a member of the Stasi. So, whatever. All right. So I got to the end. And let me mention that where you have just finished chapter 9 in the Mizuoka book on subsumption. He started kind of heavy duty in the theoretical, but he's speaking as a geographer, and he's fitting it in with many of the ideas that he's gotten because he's a student of David Harvey, among others. And so he's sitting in a kind of interesting sort of critical space. And he mentions this in his other works about the role of critical geography in Japan, which is different than how critical geography operates in certain other countries, for a variety of the usual, interpolitical sort of the academic politics of it. So anyway, so there's a theoretical component here that's I think very useful, and one that allows for a certain structural approach, and it fits the larger critique, the political critique of the difference between Fordist production and post-Fordist or neoliberal production, and tries to place it in a kind of situation that includes other ideas. Now, he didn't go super far, but I mean, he could have gone even further in terms of, but I think he went as far as he could relative to using Lefebvre, for example, because Lefebvre, although I'm not sure he's completely informed by it, but Lefebvre talking about the body is not that different than Foucault talking about it. So there's that. And of course, Lefebvre fits an entire French sociology thing that happened during the post-war period. So there's that. And in geography, it has all of this other stuff. And then the Marxist thing is there as well in terms of describing it as sort of differential exploitation. And in fact, you can argue that operates, that's operated in American history, certainly, and continues to operate relative to the prison industrial complex. So there's that. All right. So let me stop the